For much of my life, I didn't realize I was checking out mentally, emotionally, and physically. I wasn't very present in tasks or deadlines and obligations. I showed up, I performed well, and I got things done. But on the inside, I often felt detached, numb, or like I was watching myself from the outside. There was a distance between me and my own experience. My body, in a way, felt muted, and my emotions felt really far away. And because I was still functioning and still achieving, I didn't recognize this as a problem. In fact, at the time, I thought this was focus. I thought it was discipline. And I even thought that it was resilience. And what I didn't know then was that this separation, this checking out, was actually what we call dissociation. And dissociation wasn't a flaw in me. Dissociation was my nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is to try everything to keep me safe. And for many high-achieving women with trauma histories, dissociation doesn't look dramatic on the outside. It doesn't always look like losing time or forgetting who you are. More often, it can look like competence. When we are dissociated, we can still function well. We can overachieve, and we can appear really composed and really capable and really reliable. But underneath, our nervous systems may still be operating from survival mode, which means that we are relying on strategies that once helped us to cope, but no longer serve us in the present moment. And so this can look like staying really busy and really productive and in our heads. And so slowly, almost invisibly, we begin to lose contact with our physical bodies and our inner world. So if you've noticed a numbness or maybe a fog or a sense of going through the motions, if rest has ever felt uncomfortable for you, or when it's time to slow down, it feels unsafe, you are not broken. Your nervous system has learned these specific patterns for a reason. And in today's episode, we are going to gently explore dissociation. We're going to take a deep dive into what it actually is, how it develops, and why it shows up so often in high-achieving women. We're going to talk about how trauma shapes the nervous system, how chronic stress, prolonged stress, and perfectionism can reinforce this disconnection, and how presence isn't something that we force. Presence is something that we reclaim safely. But before I go any further, I want to name some takeaways that I'd like you to hold on to as we move through this conversation. And the first one is that dissociation is adaptive. It is not a flaw. It is a survival mechanism and not a personal failure. Secondly, trauma rewires the nervous system. And so patterns like overworking, self-pressure, and self-criticism can keep those survival responses active long after the original threat has passed. And third, reconnection with ourselves and the world doesn't happen all at once. Reconnection begins with awareness, with small, safe moments of noticing your breath and your body and your internal signals. You do not have to push yourself into presence. You do not have to force anything to change. We start exactly where you are. And from there, we begin to reclaim what was never lost, just protected. So today, again, let's listen for how dissociation is adaptive and how trauma is rewiring our nervous system and how awareness in small, safe practices can help us reclaim and reconnect with our body and our mind. Welcome to Reclaiming Me, a trauma-informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can finally release people-pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, therapist, trauma specialist, and a woman who has walked this path both personally and professionally. Welcome back, everybody. I am so glad that you joined me again this week for a little bit more on embodiment and specifically dissociation. And I just want to start out by saying that dissociation is one of those concepts that I personally feel is highly misunderstood and misinterpreted in the mental health field. And so today I hope to shed some light on the truth about dissociation and how it is smart and how it can protect us. And sometimes we might need it, right? But today we're going to talk about how it can become maladaptive and ways that we might gently begin to work with it versus against it. And so I have a little personal reflection. I guess you could call it my dissociation story. And dissociation for me, it crept in very gradually. So I didn't wake up one day and realize I am disconnected from my body right now. It started in really subtle ways. So, for example, I can remember sitting in college classes and experiencing a numbness in my hands and my feet and a fog in my mind when I would get stressed out about deadlines and tests, or if I was ever taking an exam. I can just remember it feeling almost like there was a dirty glass and I couldn't clean it on the outside because the fog was on the inside. And having this sense that I was observing my life instead of fully participating in it or living it. And at the time that all this was going on, none of this really felt alarming to me. I just assumed that this was how everybody felt. I thought, okay, this is focus. This is what it means to be disciplined, to lock in, to be resilient. And I didn't know then that this sense of distance, this separation from my physical body, from my presence, was actually my nervous system just trying to keep me safe. And as a child, noticing these emotions or bodily signals didn't feel safe for me. So if I think back to my childhood, I can remember having a lot of stomach issues, a lot of stomach aches, but that was really kind of where it stopped. Things like hunger and fatigue, fear, even excitement were not neutral experiences. These experiences, when they happened, things like hunger, fatigue, fear, excitement, they could feel at times really inconvenient. That's the best way I know to describe it, or maybe really overwhelming. And based on how others experienced this at times, unwelcome. And so my nervous system adapted the way nervous systems do. And it learned how to keep my body moving, functioning, showing up, pressing forward, while my awareness, my sense of embodiment, my sense of self quietly started to step back. And at the time, again, I didn't think of this as dissociation. I don't even think I knew what that word meant until adulthood. I thought of it as being, again, really just low maintenance and strong and, oh, this one, not needing very much. And as I moved into adolescence, what I began to understand is that this pattern became more sophisticated. And I didn't understand the sophistication again until I was an adult, because in adolescence, I didn't really struggle all too much with school. I could keep up just fine. I could keep up with sports and theater, social expectations, as long as I was busy and as long as I stayed in perpetual motion. I didn't have to feel what was happening inside of my body. And as I moved through adolescence and then into young adulthood, this achievement that I got as a result of pushing forward became kind of an anesthesia to me. Multitasking just kept me out of my body most of the time. And productivity really gave me something very solid to hold on to when my internal world felt very vague or very unreachable. And by full-blown adulthood, dissociation for me was almost completely invisible, both to the outside world and to me. So if I were in a moment of dissociation, for example, no one would probably recognize it unless they were a trained mental health professional. And I certainly couldn't recognize it because, again, I looked really capable and really competent and super motivated. And we know that society loves that, especially in women, and we reward it. But inside, there was this incongruency happening. There was this part of me that kind of, maybe, I guess the best way to describe it is that I was always kind of slightly off to the side. Like, I knew that I was there, but I wasn't really there. It was like I was living adjacent to my own life. And it was really strange to start being able to put more concrete words to this. Fast forward to well into motherhood, and I remember sitting in different therapists' office over the years, talking really objectively about painful experiences that had happened to me over my life, losses, betrayals, really grief, right? Like with my mother and my father and just my whole upbringing. Moments that if anyone else were talking about it, I would look for emotion now as a therapist. But at the time, again, these were moments that should have registered, as deeply distressing. And I could sit there and talk about them very clearly, very calmly, almost clinically. And it was really confusing to me. I would question myself, don't I feel something about this? Because I knew I did deep down, but it was like I was frozen in my body. And then the therapist would ask that question, where do you feel that in your body? And I would instantly feel pissed off. And what I have also learned, just a side note, is that now being a therapist, this question can be very triggering to complex trauma survivors. And so we have to approach it, but we have to approach it very skillfully and very delicately. And it probably needs to come well into trust building, right? So we wouldn't want to approach somebody with this if we did not have that relationship or rapport with them yet. That's just a little side note. And it didn't piss me off because the question was wrong, but it pissed me off because I didn't have an answer. So I would scan internally when this question was asked, and like it was just hollow. I would find nothing. Or I might find a fog, or just an emptiness where I knew sensation was supposed to be. And sometimes, oftentimes, honestly, I wondered if I was doing therapy wrong. Other times, I wondered if something was just fundamentally missing in me. So did this not hurt me? Like, did I not feel things the way other people did? Did I not actually register what had happened? And there was a quiet shame in that confusion. And if I could describe painful events almost as if they had happened to somebody else, what did that say about me? Was I disconnected? Was I cold? Was I broken? And what I did not understand then was that this was the pain. It was just being expressed through absence rather than intensity. My nervous system was never failing me. It was always protecting me. And this is where so many women find themselves. So as I talked about in the last episode, women are significantly more likely to develop trauma-related nervous system adaptations. And this is not because we are weaker, but it's because of the kinds of relational and social pressures that many of us grow up with. So dissociation in that context doesn't feel like a disorder at all. It feels like normal functioning. But it's actually a survival strategy. So again, it's one that once protected us and one that we can gently learn to renegotiate. So let's get into what is happening in the nervous system when dissociation develops. And why does it feel so necessary for us? So we're going to transition into a little bit of psychoeducation because I'm just love to nerd out. And before we talk about dissociation, we need to talk about the system that makes dissociation possible. And this is called the autonomic nervous system. And I always remember this by the part of the word auto, because it's like autopilot, right? Like we don't even have to think about it. It's the part of our nervous system that works automatically and without conscious thought. And the autonomic nervous system is responsible for controlling things like your heart rate, your breathing, your digestion, your muscle tension, your energy levels, and your sense of safety or threat. And that's really crucial to understand. Because we don't decide to speed up our hearts when we're scared, right? We don't choose to feel heavy or numb when we're overwhelmed. your autonomic nervous system does this for you. And at its core, the autonomic nervous system is always really just asking one question. And that question is, am I safe right now? And so if the answer to that is yes, then it can go on to support things like true connection with other people and that space where we get to be very curious and playful and present. However, if the answer is no, or even maybe, then it shifts your body into protection mode. And so this happens constantly, often outside of awareness. And if you tuned into last week's episode, I shared a little fun fact about how our brain and our body is scanning for threat 7 times a second. And if we've lived in chronic chaos or unpredictability, trauma, we are probably always either a no or a maybe. So Stephen Porges, still haven't learned his name, sorry. He is responsible for the polyvagal theory. And I want to talk a little bit about the polyvagal theory because it gives us a map, essentially, for how these protective responses work. So according to this model, our nervous system moves through 3 main states. And it doesn't do this in a linear way, but fluidly, depending on what our body senses. And so we're going to talk about the first state called the ventral vagal state. And I know this is a lot of new words for a lot of us, but just hang in there. And the ventral vagal state, so think of this state as the state of safety and connection. And so when we are in the ventral vagal state, our body feels relatively settled. Your breathing is steady. Your muscles are not braced for impact. Cognitively, you can think clearly. You can feel emotions without being flooded or consumed with them. And you can engage with other people and with yourself. And so examples of residing in the ventral vagal state might feel like laughing with a friend or being absorbed in a really creative task. And that's important to distinguish between like a work task, right? Because some of us might have work environments where we feel like we're constantly under a deadline. Or maybe it's feeling really grounded during a calm conversation. So feeling your feet on the floor, your seat in the chair, and you're just really locked in and you're just aware. You don't really have track of time. Or simply being able to just rest without the guilt. But unfortunately, for a lot of us, we can't live in the ventral vagal forever. We can kick in at times into what's called sympathetic activation, which another common phrase for this is fight or flight. So this sympathetic activation is our body's mobilization system. So when our nervous system begins to sense any kind of threat, whether this is a physical threat or emotional conflict even, pressure, overload, what this does is it begins to increase energy in the body in order to prepare us to act on it. And so in real life, some examples of sympathetic activation or fight-flight can be racing thoughts, even if your body is really tired. And I like to call this wired but tired. Or just a anxiety or maybe even a panic feeling. Irritability, urgency, overworking, or feeling like you cannot slow down even when you're exhausted. Again, wired but tired. And this is not a failure of regulation. Rather, it is your body, again, trying to protect you by keeping you alert and ready. Think of it as like sitting in a car and it's in park and you're just revving the engine over and over. Well, eventually what can happen with that is it's going to burn out, right? The car engine is just going to go kaput. We need to have a cooling off period. But if we've spent a long time in either a low level sympathetic activation or even high sympathetic activation, fight or flight, our body has to, kind of come down off that, right? And so this is what we would refer to as dorsal vagal shutdown, or otherwise known as freeze and dissociation. So when fight or flight doesn't feel possible, or maybe it just hasn't worked to achieve what we're trying to achieve, the nervous system conserves energy by beginning to reduce the sensation and the awareness around it. So in everyday terms, this might feel like numbness or emptiness. This is where the brain fog can come in. Difficulty articulating our thoughts, difficulty even thinking clearly, or feeling just really disconnected from our body and our surroundings. So this is protection through withdrawal. So after learning these 3 states of the polyvagal theory, I had an aha moment about why dissociation has always felt so confusing. Because we are functioning, we are working, we are showing up. But internally, parts of ourselves feel very distant, very far away. And so again, the purpose of this episode is not about labeling yourself. It is about realizing that your body has been doing its job, often for a really long time. And for many high-achieving women, these patterns, again, they blend seamlessly into productivity and caretaking and perfectionism and overfunctioning. And so next, I want to talk a little bit about how dissociation shows up specifically in high-achieving women. And more importantly, how do we start reconnecting safely? So one of the reasons, again, that dissociation is so dang hard to recognize is that it often masquerades as competence. And so, yes, organized, capable, but disconnected. On the outside, we're fine. And on the inside, we're muted, or we're distant, or we're effortful. And so one pattern that I noticed in my own life was this constant mental activity while my body felt really numb or really tense. So when I transitioned from being a full-time teacher to staying at home with my oldest son back in 2005, I did not know how to be still. I did not know what it felt like to be settled and to connect with my baby. I did not know how to just exist in my body. Instead, I kept moving. And I think I've shared this before here on the podcast, but I had a C-section with him, and the doctor's orders were that I do not lift heavy objects and I do not have strenuous exercise for at least the first 6 weeks. And I'm telling on myself, but I'd come home and again, quit my job. So I'm home with this little baby and all of these needs and nobody in the house because my husband was at work. And so what do? I start looking around at the baseboards and I think, oh, those are dirty. It's time to clean those. And so I strapped him in my baby Bjorn and I got on my hands and knees. This was the first week after my cesarean section, y'all. So this is how extreme it was. And I began scrubbing the baseboards. And then that wasn't enough. And so then I began pushing this huge, heavy vacuum because, again, this is before they made vacuums all like nice and sleek and weightless, right? And I would push them uphill in a baby jogger. And then I would begin a slow jog. And I did this all within the first 3 weeks of delivering him. And when I wasn't physically moving my body, I was planning. I kept busy in every way that I could. And that busyness meant that I wasn't fully present. I couldn't be fully present. It was almost as if I was coming out of my own skin. I went to Target multiple times a day looking for crafts, looking for things to do. And what I know now is that I was hungry for connection and support. I was hungry for somebody to tell me that I could rest, somebody to take that off of my plate. I'm not sure if I would have fully accepted it, but I think deep down that's what I needed. My mind was working constantly, but my body was somewhere else. So a third pattern is ignoring our physical cues. I ignored hunger and fatigue. Let's see, how do I want to say this? Across the span of my adolescence and adulthood, I have ignored my hunger, my fatigue, and again, even my pain. I've always been a runner. It's been a great way for me to turn my brain off and just lock in. But long runs would begin to leave my body aching. But I started to just push through that pain. And as I've gotten older, in my 40s specifically, I can't do this as much anymore. And I don't want to do it as much anymore. But when I was doing all of this in my teens and 20s and 30s, I didn't notice the tight shoulders. I didn't notice the shallow breathing or the exhaustion. I barely recognized it as discomfort. My body was something to manage, and it was not something to inhabit. And then another pattern, the chronic self-monitoring and perfectionism. I have monitored myself constantly my whole life, essentially. In adulthood, I would monitor myself as a teacher. I would monitor myself as a mother, as a partner. And if I could stay organized in this monitoring, then that meant that I could keep everything on track and I could meet expectations perfectly. And maybe, just maybe, that internal chaos would stay at bay. And this was survival in action, right? And all of this came together for me in a really clear way. I could meet deadlines, I could manage the responsibilities, I could lead the projects, but my body, again, was so separate. I would go in and get massages, and the massage therapist would say, "My gosh, you've got knots in your shoulders." And I didn't know what he was talking about. And even simple moments, right, of just being present with others, these have been uncomfortable for me because, again, nervous system, not knowing how to just be in a body without movement or planning. And so I share all of this with you today because I want to emphasize why awareness is such a powerful first step. So if you relate to this, the noticing the subtle signals, the shallow breath, the tightness of the shoulders, that sense of spacing out, when we begin to notice this, this is radical stuff for the nervous system. Because what it communicates is, hey, I'm trying to get your attention. We're safe. We can exist in our body. And reconnecting with this part of ourselves, it really is not about abandonment. It's not about abandoning our ambition. and our competence and our productivity. I get this question all the time from clients. Does this mean that I'm just going to have to be a big blob and never set goals and never have drive? Absolutely not. But we have to start with gentle noticing and small, safe practices, and gradually, because this rebuilds our presence. It rebuilds our agency, and it rebuilds our choice. And we know that when we are in choice, this is where emotional regulation and rest and joy really begin. So I hope that the big takeaway that you're hearing over and over is that this is an adaptive thing. Dissociation has helped you to survive, but it can also feel really isolating, and it can feel like you're watching your life go by instead of fully participating in it. And so I don't want the message to be that healing is about forcing presence or denying our achievements again, or slowing down so drastically that you have to quit your job and just figure out your next life move. But no, we're talking about gently reclaiming our nervous system and our body one moment at a time. So these brief moments are really powerful. And as I've talked about before, things like pausing to notice our breath, the weight of our body in a chair. This is all space for choice, space to respond instead of automatically reacting. And so maybe one day you notice your jaw is tight. And instead of pushing through, you begin to allow a slow exhale. Or maybe you feel a flutter of anxiety in your stomach and you pause just long enough to go, I see you. I'm safe. And these little tiny acts are building blocks because it teaches us that our nervous system can relax, even if it's just a little bit, and that you can fully exist in your body. And when I first started practicing this myself, after years of running and planning and overriding sensation, I can remember just noticing a shallow breath or softening my shoulders felt so deeply radical for me. And I didn't need to change everything about my life. I didn't need to stop teaching or stop being a therapist or stop parenting or stop moving. I just began noticing and feeling more present, more attuned in conversations, more aware of what my body actually needed. So, for women who've spent years of prioritizing action over sensation, this reclamation is revolutionary. And each moment teaches you, again, that you're safe. And over time, these moments build into a life that begins to feel more grounded and more embodied and more connected to yourself without giving up who you are or what you want to do. So as we begin to close today, I want to take a moment to just gently revisit what we have explored together. And that is first, dissociation's adaptive. It is not a flaw. It is not a failure. And it is not something that means you're broken. It is something that your nervous system learned in order to help you survive when there were no other options. And this deserves understanding and not shame. Secondly, trauma rewires the nervous system. And when your nervous system spent years navigating chronic stress, relational wounds, high expectations, patterns like overfunctioning, perfectionism, and constant mental activity that can quietly reinforce disconnection from the body, especially for high-achieving women. It can look like competence, while safety is still being negotiated internally. And finally, reconnection. It does not begin with fixing or forcing yourself to feel more. It begins with awareness. These small, tiny moments of noticing breath, posture, sensation, absence of sensation. These moments signal presence is possible. You are safe, and you can inhabit your body again at your own pace. Healing doesn't require doing this perfectly. It requires doing it kindly. So thank you for being here today. I hope you'll join me next week on Reclaiming Me. Thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope you leave feeling a little lighter, a little more grounded, and a little closer to trusting yourself and your inner experience. If this episode resonated with you, please follow or subscribe so future conversations can meet you when they're needed. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, consider sharing this episode with them. That's one of the ways this work reaches the people who need it the most. You can find me on Instagram at Cindy Payne Rooted, and you can also visit me at cindypayne.com, where you'll find all episode links, blog posts, practice updates, and a free people-pleasing style quiz designed to help you notice your patterns with more compassion. And remember, every small step towards healing, self-trust, and presence matters. You are worthy of this journey. Thanks, everyone.